The countdown is on in Europe. This is Bloomberg Markets European Close with Guy Johnson and Alex Steele.
Here's everything you need to know at Europe at this hour, 30 minutes until the close of trading on this Friday. In search of coordination, Italy pushing for a G20 extraordinary summit to try and manage the Afghan crisis. And travel time. The UK moves Canada and 6 other territories to its green list, allowing travelers to skip quarantine regardless of their vaccination status. And Powell's dovish taper. Fed Chair Jay Powell reassuring the market, not signaling a September taper, while sounding cautious on the labor market, plus saying inflation is transitory. I'm Alex Steele here in the U.S., joined by Francine Lacqua over in London, who is in for Guy Johnson. Powell seemed to deliver what he wanted, like a dovish type of taper. Now, some strategists say it wasn't dovish at all. He's very clear on what the timeline is now to some extent.
Yeah, he is quite clear. But if you look actually, and I know Twitter is alight with people saying it's a dovish comment. No, it wasn't a dovish speech. But actually, if you look at the initial market reaction straight away, Alex, I'm looking at stocks up, yields down, dollar weaker, corporate credit actually tightening. So it does probably point, all things equal, to a dovish speech. Now, this is what the markets are doing in Europe. I think there's also a little bit of assurance. Again, thin volumes. Don't forget, Monday's also bank holiday here in the UK, so even less traders than there would have been maybe last week on their desk. You can see the European stocks 600, probably traders taking, though, a little bit of assurance from comments of Jay Powell that they will guide the markets through this, and that's a lot of things that people were expecting. Gold climbing. Look, it's definitely climbing for a whole week. This was also in part to what we heard from Jay Powell. And then we have some great charts that our Eddie van der Waalt put together. Gold was wavering this year, but over the last couple of weeks, it hasn't done badly at all, Alex.
No, it has not. Also helped by a weaker dollar this week as well. So in the U.S., it's kind of like buy all the stuff except for the dollar. So here's what we're looking at. The S&P up by 0.8%, but you have the cyclicals outperforming, energy, materials, etc. You also, though, overall within the indices are still having tech. The momentum trades outperform. The NASDAQ is beating the S&P as well as the Dow. You're also going to want to go and buy treasuries. The 5-year, though, is really what's outperforming, although in the 10-year space, you do have yields down by about 2 basis points. So that all speaking to that relief rally. Bloomberg Dollar Index turning lower on Powell's comments, now down by 0.3%. If you're going to have a clear taper timeline, if there's going to be that dovish taper, that's how the market seems to be reacting, whether or not you agree with that statement or not. Brent crude also getting some help from a weaker dollar, but very different in this case because you have Tropical Storm Ida is going to be hitting landfall tomorrow in Louisiana, which is 16th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina this weekend. Also, you're looking at it's going to hit Cuba, western Cuba, that area kind of shutting down. So that really winds up having a severe impact on oil rigs. We're already seeing companies, Francine, start to vacate those platforms.
Yeah, we'll talk a lot more about the markets. Let's also start with new travel guidelines, Alex. The UK moving Canada and 6 other territories to its green list while holding off tightening rules for arrivals to the US. Well, joining us now is Bloomberg's Sid Phillips. So, Sid, some countries put on the green list. If you're vaccinated or not, it doesn't matter. You can go backwards and forwards. But, for example, Turkey was hoping to be on the list, and they're not.
Absolutely. I mean, travel companies were hoping to get some winter sun destinations, and Turkey is one of the major winter sun destinations for the UK. And that didn't happen. And so travel companies are a bit disappointed with the outlook at the moment for the winter season.
Sid, what about the U.S.? The U.S. we're still allowed, we're still on that amber list. Do you feel like there are going to be any updates there?
So there was some concern, especially since the European Union is considering putting the US off its white list. So there was some concern that the UK might follow, but the US so far survived on the amber list. That means that vaccinated travelers from the US can come in without quarantine and just test required.
All right, so I can still go. I can still go visit Guy, number one. Okay, Sid, thanks a lot. Bloomberg Sid Phillip joining us
and
there.
Fran.
Yeah, and Francine. I'm sorry, and Francine. Guy and I had a long-running joke, like who's going to get to go first across the Atlantic.
Yeah, I'll take you out for drinks.
Oh, I'm in. Totally. So, got me a drinks. Okay, let's go on the virus right now. You got Scotland reporting a record number of new infections, while a new research paper now showing that people who recovered from COVID in some of the earlier waves have a lower risk of contracting the Delta variant than those who got the Pfizer vaccine. Joining us now is Deirdre Hipwell, a Bloomberg consumer and healthcare reporter. Deirdre, walk me through the study and what we learned from that.
Well, this is a large real-world study. I mean, it is a preprint, so it hasn't been reviewed yet. But what it is showing is that people who've recovered from a bout of COVID-19 during one of the earlier waves of the pandemic appear to have a lower risk of contracting the virus again than those who've had 2 doses of the vaccine from Pfizer and BioNTech. And the actual figures were people who'd had a vaccine were almost 6-fold times more likely to contract a Delta infection and 7-fold more likely to have symptomatic disease. Now, this is obviously good news for people who have survived COVID, but I think that the danger of studies like this is that this might encourage vaccine holdouts not to get the vaccine because they think, well, if I get COVID, it'll be fine because I'll have better natural immunity.
Deirdre, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Deirdre Hipwell there. Now, Deutsche Bank, on to some of the things that we saw in sustainability. Deutsche Bank asset manager DWS hitting back at claims that it overstated the amount of ESG assets. Joining us now is Steve Ahrens, Bloomberg German banks reporter. Steve, we broke that story yesterday, and now DWS is actually hitting back, saying that's not true.
That's right. To a certain extent, I mean, they're not denying that this former executive who's been making these allegations, that what she's saying is actually that many of the allegations she's made are untrue. But they are saying we stand by our disclosures. She's alleging that they describe assets under management as ESG related, even though they aren't really. The DWS has given some explanation why that isn't right, but the share price is actually down today again. It fell dramatically yesterday, and it's declined a little today. So it seems like investors are not completely buying into the DWS explanation.
It's definitely not over for the space, though, with no cohesive rules there. Steve, thanks very much. Steve Ahrens joining us from Bloomberg. We do have some breaking news. A Pentagon briefing underway. The Pentagon just saying that there was no second explosion in Kabul on Thursday, despite initial contrary reports. Joining us now with more is Emery Hordern, a Bloomberg Washington correspondent. So this is sort of 24 hours after that very chaotic Thursday. Emery, what are we learning?
Yeah, incredibly chaotic Thursday yesterday, where we thought there was 2 terror attacks, a suicide bomber outside the Abbey Gate, where the U.S. military is letting people in, and then as well a nearby hotel that's about a mile away that many people that visit Afghanistan and Kabul would stay at. Now we are hearing that there's actually only 1 explosion from the Pentagon, and the Pentagon saying that in these very dramatic events, sometimes reports can get misrepresented. So right now we know that there was only 1 suicide bomber, and that was at the Abbey Gate. We're also learning that within the last 24 hours, they were able to evacuate another 300 Americans. That brings the total to a little bit more than 5,000. This is the news we're getting from the Pentagon. That briefing ongoing. We're going to continue to get the updates from the Pentagon. But we should make note, given the fact that the intelligence community does assess that this was carried out by ISIS-K. We heard from General McKenzie yesterday saying that these attacks are very real, something that the military is prepared for. So we are going into a very precarious and scary situation on the ground, a quite dicey situation in terms of finishing this evacuation by August 31st, with the fact that they do know that there could be potential more terrorist threats on the ground.
Anne-Marie, we heard from the French, we heard from the UK that actually they will end some of their airlifts very soon because of the chaotic situation on the ground. Yeah. Will the US continue?
Yeah, we have heard from European international partners that they're starting to wind this down. The U.S. says they will continue. They will continue till August 31st. We do know that the president had asked the Department of Defense as well as the State Department to draw up contingency plans just in case. But right now, the military, the Pentagon, thinks that they can get this mission done by August 31st. Francine, what comes after August 31st is very interesting. We have Luigi Di Maio, the Italian foreign minister, meeting with the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, just about an hour ago. And the Italians are really pushing, and they hold the presidency for the G20. They're really pushing for a G20 meeting to talk about what happens post August 31st. Now, Russia, China, and Turkey are a part of that G20, and we have heard from the likes of President Erdogan of Turkey that he actually would want to maintain the security of that airport, doing a deal with the Taliban. I think a lot of partners would want to see that happen, but potentially we need to see if yesterday's suicide bombing at the Kabul airport, which the Pentagon has told us it was just that 1 suicide bombing, is that going to potentially change the security of the airport going forward after August 31st?
Anne-Marie, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern there at the White House. And then coming up a little bit later this hour, Michael Chertoff, former U.S. Secretary of Homeland. Now, coming up, we talk markets, we talk Fed, we talk, of course, Jay Powell, the stock 600 on track for a 7th straight month of gains. We'll discuss all of that with Luke Hickmore of Aberdeen Standard Investments shortly. This is Bloomberg.
The timing and pace of the coming reduction in asset purchases will not be intended to carry a direct signal regarding the timing of interest rate liftoff, for which we have articulated a different and substantially more stringent test.
Well, that was Fed Chair Jay Powell speaking earlier at its Jackson Hole virtual symposium. Joining us now is Luke Hickmore, Aberdeen Standard Investments Director. Thank you so much, Luke, for joining us. Is anything surprising of what you heard from Jay Powell? Does it make you change, some of your portfolio structure at all?
I think I've ended up a little bit more bullish post Jerome Powell. Not dramatically, but there's a few things that have started to move afterwards. We're seeing crossover high yield index from CDS just moving a little tighter in the US, in particular through the CDX version of that. Bitcoin's moving. That's exciting. Other than that, I guess for me, it kind of felt that the Fed were trying to avoid a flattening at the long end of the curve. This is like a setup. We know tapering's coming. He made that very clear. We knew that anyway. No surprise. The timing, who knows? But it's probably going to be this year now. But the sequence where they've got to get a really tough set of criteria for interest rates to rise. He doesn't want those rates to rise, flatten the curve at the front end when the back end's already flat and could invert. And we all know 2s, 10s, if that inverts, that's telling you a recession's coming. Yeah. As it did in September 2019. Nobody could have seen COVID, but 2s, 10s saw COVID. They want to try and avoid that, I think. And this felt like a setup to that.
Well, Luke, what we also saw this week was a pretty decent sell-off in the bond market that in some part was led by Europe. And Francine had picked up on the fact that chief economist at the ECB, Philip Lane, sort of paved the way for a discussion about reducing PEP purchases. Do you think that we see the end of policy divergence now? Do you need to start playing that or not?
I think probably not. The problems Europe's still got structurally generating inflation haven't gone away. The ECB will remove the emergency purchases, but the asset purchase program is likely to continue in the background until they actually see some inflation coming through. And that remains difficult and hard to see where that's going to happen right across Europe. Whereas the US, I kind of disagree with Jerome Powell. I don't think it is as transitory as he suspects. For me, there are more structural issues there, but in Europe, maybe not.
Right, but both central banks, Luke, are really at pains to say, look, even if we start tapering, it's not a signal of a rate hike. Yeah. How difficult will that be to convince the market that is the case?
In Europe, not difficult at all. In the US, I think increasingly. We saw the University of Michigan 1 year ahead inflation numbers against A, still 4.6%. That's been high now for the last 3 months. People are worried about inflation, and if that really catches hold in the psyche of the American people, I think it's hard to stop inflation. Probably not massive, but even if it comes 2.5%, 3%, he's going to have to maybe speed up tapering to get to that point where he can start putting rates up.
So what kind of risk would you put on, actually a different question related, how fast do you think the Fed will actually taper once they start? And I say that because if I go back to my previous question about the ECB, someone said it earlier today in one of their notes, the ECB is not a passive bystander. Like, they'd have to do something if there was a sort of more aggressive push to pare back the asset purchase program.
Yeah, and I guess the currencies are going to give us that kind of clue on if we get the dollar running away against euro, that may be something the ECB has to do something against. Let's get to December. Let's see what next month's payrolls are going to do, whether that starts pushing on the employment button as well. And it does look like Delta may have peaked. So I suspect, given some of the other Fed members that you've had on today, that it feels a faster pace of tapering than we had in 2013, which was roughly a year. This feels maybe 6 months to 9 months in terms of tapering, which the market seems pretty well set up for, to be fair. And even when we get rate rises at the end of all of that, it's probably not going to be much either.
Look, I don't know. I know you were tongue-in-cheek, but I know you mentioned crypto. Are you suggesting that crypto now follows Fed speeches?
Well, you know, having a little bit, it's just a PA trade, this one. I have none for clients, nor does, as far as we're aware, Aberdeen. But it does move quite a lot on suggestions around QE. And I suppose it's fair enough, isn't it? I mean, if you're pushing money into people's pockets and they're finding something to do with it, it seems to be a good beneficiary of that.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can see the momentum trade, like in tech and the NASDAQ outperforming, and they are tending to move together as well. What also is doing really well is tech over in Europe, and overall, you have European stocks headed to its 7th straight monthly gain. That would have been the longest since 2012 and 2013. It's a twofold question. One, can you buy European stocks at this level? And two, will this rally sustain itself?
I think my favourite place in Europe, and maybe it's because I'm in Scotland, is the UK. I would be buying mid-cap UK, maybe small-cap UK. The possibilities here for recovery there are still very good, and they've lagged behind a lot of other markets. Europe, yes, I do agree. Actually, our head of European equities is very much keen on small and mid-cap tech-type situations around Europe. He's seeing a lot of growth there.
Wait, look, you love the UK more than the rest of Europe. This is despite significant pound volatility and also despite some of the labor shortages.
Yeah, the labour shortage is the difficult one. You go in a supermarket here, as you'll know, Francine, there are many empty shelves. And it's going to push up, I think it is going to push up inflation. And people need to realise here in the UK that, we've had people in jobs too cheaply for too long. And there is a cost for that to come down in the future. But I think right now, it does suggest that we're going to get some, well, that doesn't suggest, but I think we are getting growth coming through. We're well on top of COVID, even with the big numbers in Scotland today. I think that the growth is coming through in the right places to benefit small and mid-cap in the UK in particular.
Okay, Luke, thanks a lot. Really appreciate it. We do the labor shortages, though. You can't get milkshakes at McDonald's. It's a different story there in the UK. Luke Hickmore of Aberdeen Standard Investments, thank you very much. This is Bloomberg.
It's time for the Bloomberg Business Flash to look at some of the biggest business stories in the news right now. I'm Ritika Gupta. China reportedly is taking steps that could thwart the ambitions of tech firms that want to list abroad. Dow Jones reports that the government plans to ban companies with large amounts of sensitive consumer data from going public in the US. The move could give Beijing more control over the complex structure Chinese tech companies use to sidestep restrictions on foreign investment. Peloton shares are tumbling after delivering worse than expected quarterly results. First quarter sales outlook missed estimates as the at-home fitness company slashed the price of most of its most popular bike. Peloton also confirmed it's been subpoenaed by the US Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security over its reporting of treadmill injuries.
We will always cooperate with authorities whenever there's an investigation. We're proud of what we're doing. We're making the right decisions. We don't have anything to hide. I will say that another government agency, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, also I won't say investigated us, but we were working with them to get on the right side of the line with safety for our tread, our lower price tread that we just announced is going to be for sale next week in the UK and Canada and the US for the first time.
There's a chance that Audi could build cars in the US. The CEO of the German automaker Markus Duesmann spoke to Bloomberg Television about the chances.
Discussions on a possible production in the US are ongoing, but we don't know at the moment what the result will be. But we do have factories where we produce platforms that Audi also uses. So it is an important point. US market is super important for us. The customers are super important for us. And the likelihood of us producing in the US is there, yes.
Duesman also said that Audi will stop making hybrid cars when it phases out combustion engine vehicles in 2033. And that is your latest business flash. Alex Brown.
All right, thanks so much, Ritika. So this is all obviously, Francine, part of Volkswagen's extremely large push into electric vehicles. In fact, apparently Audi's new cars will be fully electric after 2026 onwards. Like, my issue is that the goals are great, but if you don't have charging stations readily available and the charging takes a little too long, like I don't know how you solve that problem no matter how many EVs you make.
Yeah, which is why you need that infrastructure bill, like in the U.S., to really have the component of building roads, fast. And the problem is the timeline. So you can actually say, right, I'm going to give $1 billion, $2 billion to this state to build, for example, an infrastructure so that we have EVs. But does that come after you've bought a car? Alex, the other thing is battery and power storage. It goes back to Ed Ludlow's fabulous, really quite amazing scoop, saying that Rivian wants a valuation of $80 billion. And so I don't know whether it's first mover advantage because they're now considered as one of, probably the most serious contender to take on Tesla. Yeah, and also it depends how quickly you can get the price down, which leads to parity, because once you get parity for EVs, for internal combustion engines, then you're good. Then you're definitely off to the races. But to your point in terms of Rivian, that's also kind of a different beast because that's trucks and versus regular cars. Then the third leg to all of this are huge commercial trucks that are transporting stuff. I mean, once we can start electrifying that, which is a very different story, then I think we're in a really good, then I think we're in a different spot. Whether or not you and I get an EV may not make that much of a difference, but whether or not, Amazon is able to deliver its goods in something that's an EV and greener, that's a game changer. Yeah, I have to say, they're also actually building a Lamborghini that's EV, which Matt Miller was in all his states because you can't hear the engine, and that's kind of the point if you're going to spend $1 million on a Lamborghini. So if everything's going EV, you're absolutely right. You would just wonder the infrastructure and whether that gets built in time and how fast they can ramp it up. Yeah, and that's kind of where hydrogen comes in, because if you can use hydrogen for fleets, that's a different, and they do kind of day trips and then come back and refuel, that could be a different mix, but that technology is still expensive. So anyway, still definitely in flux for that. I want to recap the Pentagon heads as the briefing is still underway here in the U.S. Apparently, the Pentagon's now saying there was only one blast that hit Kabul yesterday. You do have the spokesman, Mr. Kirby, saying they're not seeing a significant evacuating role after August 31st, so still sticking by that August 31st deadline. Still saying, though, that they won't allow attacks on homeland to emanate again. I think the question, though, is what's the appropriate response, as President Biden was talking about that yesterday. We'll be speaking to Michael Chertoff, former U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security, and Chertoff Group, a co-founder, coming up. Also, European close is up next. Really, really strong month again for European equities. This is Bloomberg. Well, let's take a look at where European markets are trading as we head to a close. 22 seconds until they close, but you can see they've had a nice day, possibly because of that dovish and very precise speech from Jay Powell over at the Jackson Hole Virtual Symposium. Now, they've had a whole pretty good month overall. It's the longest winning streak on a monthly basis for the European stock since 2013. So the bell just about to go. You can see we're still getting some 0.4%. A lot of the focus will be on the technology stocks that probably are the ones that did the best. Onto individual indices. If we have those, it will give us a good indication whether there's a difference from the CAC 40, the DAX, and the FTSE. Again, quite thin volumes, not only because it's August, but remember, here in the UK, we have a bank holiday on Monday. So a lot of stocks are closed and a lot of traders out for an extended weekend. Basic resources, real estate, technology. Again, technology, we did spend a bit of focus on it in the last couple of days. Probably the ones that were doing the best in the first 2 weeks of August. And then we had all of that regulatory concern from China. Basic resources, a pure economy play, gaining some 2%. Now, these are some of the stocks that actually I'm watching. Amongst the biggest losers in today's trading session, Just Eat. This is because New York City actually put some price caps on how much you can charge for food delivery. Juventus, this is a good one. I don't know if it's good for Cristiano Ronaldo. Also, I found out he is actually the biggest star on Instagram with 333 million followers. Wow. But Cristiano Ronaldo today saying that he's not going to stay with Juventus, and the stock is actually up some 1.9%. He wasn't cheap. And then finally, Brunello Cucinelli, interesting just because we spent so much time looking at luxury stocks because of the crackdown in China. bit of pressure on luxury stocks, but actually had a couple of banks saying Brunello Cucinelli will be okay in the next couple of months, and they've hit their targets. That stock gaining some 3%.
All right, Francine, good stuff. I want to take you back to that Pentagon briefing right now. It is ongoing here in the U.S. over Afghanistan. Yesterday, the president was vowing to go after the terrorists responsible for the Kabul attack. Now we're learning from this press briefing that potentially there was only one attack yesterday that we saw. You have the spokesperson for the Pentagon, Mr. Kirby, saying there's no significant evacuating role for the U.S. After August 31st. Also that the U.S. capability to secure the Kabul airport has not changed. So it's really hard to know the situation on the ground as information is moving so quickly, and it's really truly muddled. There is still much more to do, whether it's working with the Taliban on how to stop another terrorist attack, whether it's dealing with ISIS-K, and also there's still about 1,000 Americans that need to be evacuated. So let's get some perspective here with Michael Chertoff, former U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security, Chertoff Group co-founder and executive chairman. It's truly a pleasure to speak to you. I'm not happy that this is the occasion that we get to do it, though. What is your best knowledge of what kind of conversations will be taking place in the White House right now as President Biden pledges to have a retaliation at the same time as sticking with this August 31st withdrawal deadline?
I think they're wrestling with some conflicting challenges. On the one hand, they do need to evacuate the Americans. On the other hand, I think the president would like to adhere to his statement about August 31 to be consistent. And frankly, I mean, I think in dealing with the Taliban, that has been a big issue for the Taliban, and getting their cooperation may mean honoring, at least in general terms, the August 31 deadline. But this is going to be a very dynamic situation.
Michael Chertoff, do you see the U.S. working with the Taliban?
Well, we may wind up having some kind of cooperative relationship, at least for a period of time, for a couple of reasons. First of all, the Taliban need to consolidate their governance over Afghanistan, and they may want to have American acquiescence in that, and in fact, acquiescence of America's allies in order to be able to make this transition. But beyond that, ironically, they are now facing their own issue with radical Islamists because of ISIS-K, which is hostile to the Taliban. So they may oddly find themselves in the position of fighting a terrorist group, which would, again, make for what they call strange bedfellows.
Indeed. And I have to wonder if it sort of furthers ISIS-K, for example, is now like the Taliban and the terrorist community seems to be looked at as more moderates. I just want to update some news. The UK is now reporting that 2 British nationals and a child were killed in that Kabul attack that happened yesterday. Mr. Secretary, how does the U.S. get the rest of the people out?
Well, they may need to find additional staging areas to ask people to go to, and then use some form of transportation to remove them. They may still be able to get people into the airport in Kabul and fly them out. And they may be able to work out an arrangement to find some other airstrip that they can use. But I do think there's going to be pressure to get this done over the next 3 days or so. And I think the biggest logistical problem is getting Americans from wherever they may be in Afghanistan to a location where they can be safely removed.
Secretary, is it actually better to scale back the evacuation until they've secured it because of possibly more threats of attacks? And would the Taliban, if they could work together with the U.S., would the Taliban give the U.S. and allies more time to get out?
I think that it would be wise for the Taliban to cooperate with America and its allies to come up with a schedule that would allow the removal of people, but might extend it over a period of time. And that does not necessarily have to look as if it's inconsistent with August 31 withdrawal, because it depends what you mean by withdrawal. It may mean that you're no longer occupying a permanent position, but that you still have the ability to fly planes in and out in order to remove people.
Is the Taliban weak?
Well, its weakness is a question of compared to what. Obviously, they were stronger than the Afghan government, which was really collapsed and was, I think, being slowly undermined over a period of months before what we just saw. On the other hand, I don't think they've consolidated their governance yet. They are composed of different factions. It's not a unitary organization. And as we saw with ISIS-K, there are other extremists who are going to try to outflank the Taliban. So they're going to have their hands full in managing the ability to transition to governing, as well as dealing with what may be attacks from their extreme elements.
Will it lead to more attacks on U.S. soil?
Well, I think that's the most important question for the president and the administration. Whenever there's a platform overseas where extremist groups have a certain freedom to train and work on weapons and even obtain finances and funds, like ISIS did in Syria and Iraq, that creates a bigger risk for the United States. It also creates a risk for our allies in Europe, in many ways a bigger risk. And so we need to, again, make sure we are vigilant in monitoring what is going on in that part of the world, in Afghanistan, and seeing how that may become a platform for direct or indirect attacks against Americans in other parts of the world.
Pakistan was warning of a power vacuum earlier. They're shutting their hotels to everybody, even journalists or Americans who are just seeking some refuge in the meantime. Where do you think the biggest power vacuum is and how it affects the geopolitical inner workings of that region?
Well, Pakistan, of course, harbored the Taliban for a considerable period of time. And in fact, in many ways, there are some strong sympathizers for the Taliban. It's very much in our interest to make sure Pakistan does not succumb to what Afghanistan has experienced, because Pakistan has nuclear weapons, and that would put us into a world of danger way beyond what we've seen before. I'm not predicting that, but I'm saying Pakistan now has to be concerned about its border. We have to see whether the Iranians will take advantage of this instability in order to assert themselves further in the region. And I frankly would not be surprised if the Indians were not concerned, because they look at Afghanistan as, again, a potential launching point against them. So all of that region of South Asia is one which is going to continue to occupy our attention because of fears of instability.
Thank you so much for joining us, Michael Chertoff there of the Chertoff Group. And Alex, I think, of course, that briefing of the Pentagon is still ongoing. And we found out just moments ago from the Pentagon that they think now only one blast hit Kabul yesterday. Yeah, and it looks like still sticking to that August 31st deadline as well. Markets yesterday seemed to have an initial reaction, but now it's really harder to digest how markets should hedge or should react to what's happening in Afghanistan. The real focus was on the Fed. But what we learned, not a whole lot. No rush on rates, but the taper really in focus. We're going to bring you the latest Fed speak from Jackson Hole next with Atlanta Fed President Raphael Bostic and St. Louis Fed President Jim Bullard. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets European Close. I'm Ritika Gupta, and you're looking at a live shot of the principal room. Coming up, Fed President Loretta Mester. That's at 1 p.m. in New York, 6 p.m. in London. This is Bloomberg. Let's check in on the Bloomberg First Word News. I'm Ritika Gupta. Large crowds gathered around Kabul's airport despite warnings of more terrorist attacks. It was a day after 13 American service members and at least 75 Afghan citizens died in explosions there. The window for civilian evacuations is all but closed for thousands of Afghans. Many countries have either ended or are about to end their airlift operations. Moderate and progressive Democrats are on a collision course over how to pay for President Biden's economic agenda. The president has proposed tax hikes on wealthy households and corporations to pay for trillions in new spending. Progressives are actually seeking more, but moderates want fewer tax hikes and are hesitating on some of the spending. That's where the fight will come in starting next month. Tropical storm Ida is forecast to grow into a powerful hurricane in the coming days. It's already hitting oil and gas production in the Gulf of Mexico. Oil companies are evacuating some of their facilities there. Ida is forecast to strike Cuba today, reach hurricane strength over the Gulf tomorrow, and make landfall in Louisiana or Mississippi Sunday or Monday. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
All right, thanks so much, Ritika. So, Francine, part of the significance of what we're going to see with Ida is that it's headed straight for Louisiana. And about 16 years ago this weekend is when we had Hurricane Katrina strike. And, I mean, all indications say that it could be pretty bad. I mean, winds could reach 120 miles per hour. I'm already seeing the repercussions. There's a Children's Hospital Medical Center that's sending home some patients. 6 other areas, hospitals are locked down now until Sunday morning. So it's going to get pretty worrisome here.
Yeah, I don't know whether, you're probably closer to it than I am, but it's very clear that when small towns actually start telling residents to flee and that hospitals are sending home patients and planning to lock down before landfall, it could be, it could be maybe worse than what we've seen in the last couple of years. And also our heart goes to all the people that lost family during Hurricane Katrina. I don't know whether, Alex, it will have a direct impact on the price of oil, but it's the kind of thing that if it does go the course that we think it could go now, could significantly also hurt some of the rigs.
Yeah, and this is sort of like the typical oil reaction to these kind of headlines. You get the spike in prices. Natural gas, the same kind of thing. You've already seen most of the major oil companies send their workers home on the platforms and shutting them down. But, this is kind of par for the course. This is like trading hurricane season in the oil market. Things will get back up and running for the most part and sort of business as usual. I think the issue then comes on land. Chuck Watson, he is like the disaster modeler, and he says as of now, you could be looking at about $25 billion in damages. So we're definitely going to be watching that into the weekend. All right, well, Fed Chair Jay Powell says that the Fed could start tapering this year ahead of his virtual Jackson Hole speech. We got a view from many Fed presidents on the taper timeline, including Atlanta's Raphael Bostic. We started with his take on inflation and what he is hearing from companies.
When I talk to businesses, what they've told me is that this is episodic. They do believe that this is really driven by the pandemic circumstance. But what it's also become clear is that this episode is going to last longer than people expected. So we're going to figure out how to incorporate that into our modeling. I would say for me, what I'm seeing is really consistent with the outlook that I had before. So I'm still comfortable that we're on a good trajectory with the economy, and we should still see fairly robust growth.
Let me put you on the other side of that big mahogany table at the Fed and those who might argue for a delay. Is there an argument there? Because what seems to be happening is a problem on the supply side, and you guys address the demand side.
Well, it's certainly true that there are supply side challenges, and we've all heard many stories about supply chain issues and trying to get goods to product to meet the robust demand that's out there. I'm definitely worried about that and thinking about that. What I would also say, though, is that what we have seen, and businesses consistently tell me they are having record volumes. The demand is super strong. And so I don't think that pushes in a different direction than the types of things that we're thinking about in terms of removing some of the accommodation. I think the economy is performing extremely strong, and any weakness that we're going to see is just pulling us off of very high numbers initially.
There seems to be a feeling on Wall Street that if you end tapering, and particularly if you do it quickly, that will remove a support from the equity markets. The Fed has been contributing to the big rise we have seen in the indexes and maybe even to inflation with QE purchases. How much do you worry about financial market stability with this switch in policy coming up?
Well, I always worry about financial stability. I think it's important that we make sure that our financial system remains strong and resilient so that it can provide the services that are needed for our economy. What I do think, though, in terms of our policies is that we're really aimed at 2 other things. We're looking at maximum employment and stable prices. I think that we're doing pretty well, making good progress in both, which suggests that we should be trying to get our policies back into a more normal situation. We've been at a very extreme level of accommodation, and I think that the strain of the economy calls for us to pull off of that a little bit and let the economy stand on its own. We still have a fair amount of energy and momentum. I think that we can do our tapering faster than we have in previous episodes because of that momentum. And my expectation is the economy will continue to operate in a strong way.
Well, that's Atlanta Fed President Raphael Bostic speaking to us a little bit earlier. Now, we also talked to St. Louis Fed President James Bullard about his outlook for the year ahead.
The key word is optionality for 2022. We want to, or I would like to anyway, taper now and get it finished by the end of the first quarter. And then at that point, I think we could assess what's happening in the economy with respect to inflation. By that time, we'll have many more jobs reports, and it certainly looks like they'll all be strong to varying degrees. Unemployment will tick down with a 4 handle at that point, and then we'll be able to see in the first half of 2022 if inflation is moderating or not. And if it's moderating, then we're in great shape. And if it's not moderating, then we might have to be more aggressive. So I think that optionality has a lot of value right now. I think the purchases don't have much value right now. So it seems like the trade-off is just right to me. Let's phase out the purchases and let's give ourselves some breathing room in 2022.
Well, as you look over the forecast horizon, do you think that inflation sticks around?
Yeah, I think right now, sitting here today, I'd say 2.5% or higher in 2022 on core PCE inflation. So we're all, right now we're at 3.5 on core PCE inflation. That's the committee's preferred smooth measure of inflation, the one that's enshrined in the SEP, the Summary of Economic Projections. So it looks like we're going to have quite a bit of inflation this year. That 3.5% number measured from 1 year ago is higher than it's been in 30 years.
That was St. Louis Fed President James Bullard speaking at the Jackson Hole Symposium. But Francine, it feels like overall, I'm getting a lot of economist notes right now. They're all looking at the taper announcement in November, not looking now for a rate hike till the end of 2023, really pushing that out. But it does put a lot of pressure next week on that jobs number.
Yeah, it certainly does put a lot of pressure on that jobs number. It was interesting that, Jay Powell was maybe a glass half empty kind of view on the labor market compared to some of the hawkish comments we had from other Fed officials, because he was very clear to point out that employment is now 6 million actually below its February 2020 level, with a shortfall mostly in the still depressed private sector. So he didn't paint a picture that was actually there's so many jobs opening and we can't fill them. So I feel like he was a lot more cautious, and so maybe much more will depend on that jobs number.
What I find also really interesting, too, is a lot of strategists say, oh, well, we're waiting for clarity from the Fed. It feels like the Fed is very clear. Like there may be outlier views, like James Bullard, for example, but in terms of Powell, it feels like his view is relatively clear. So I wonder what the catalyst will actually be, particularly if they're not going to be selling any assets. They'll just be sort of running off. They won't be reinvesting them, which is different than actively selling, which is clearly different than hiking. So I wonder sort of where the volatility will then sit and in what asset class.
Yeah, but I mean, the truth of the matter, Alex, is that if you're data dependent, and actually Jay Powell also, said we want to taper, but again, I thought it was quite dovish because he wants to wait also for data on the Delta variant, which he spoke very little, which I thought was quite surprising on that. It means that actually the market maybe just want more certainty that any central bank could give them.
Yeah, exactly. They want clarity, like super, super clear timeline. That doesn't exist. It's not a thing. Okay, this is Bloomberg. Just some news for you here. Italy is going to reinstate some COVID restrictions for Sicily. That news just crossing right now. All right, lots of stuff happening next week. Go figure, the last couple days of August. But Monday, you get a UK summer bank holiday. Okay, so that's that. But Tuesday, you get the deadline for U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. You get a lot of ECB speakers, plus you get France and Italian CPI, Francine.
Yeah, Italian CPI is one that we're watching out for because of these extra COVID restrictions. Again, we've seen a flare-up in COVID cases where there have been a lot of tourists. Now, on Wednesday, OPEC meeting. This will be interesting also because Alex and I were talking about that hurricane that could actually hit the Gulf of Mexico. Then US, UK, the Eurozone, France, Germany PMIs, a good indication of actually what kind of things we've lived through the summer. And then on Thursday, US factory orders and durable good orders. And then the big one that everyone will be watching worldwide, of course, course, on Friday, it's the U.S. jobs report, Alex.
Yeah, but also I should say Manchester United confirms Ronaldo's agreement.
I know,
you talk about
and
that
he
now.
has 333 million followers. I still can't get 333 million followers for Cristiano Ronaldo, the person that has the most followers on Instagram, period.
Sports. Okay, Francine, thank you for joining me.
That's all I have.
Yeah, that's all we got. Man, we're a sports guy. We need him. Thanks for joining me, Francine, and I will see you on Monday. Happy weekend, everybody. Coming up in Balance of Power, Gregory Meeks, Foreign Affairs House Committee on Foreign Affairs Chairman, will be joining David Weston on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm headed over to Bloomberg Radio as well for the DAB Digital Radio, the cable. This is Bloomberg.